Hello everyone and welcome to our last Phyrexia All Will Be One spoiler video. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 cards for Standard. These are cards that I think are going to have a lot of impact on the format over the next couple months as we wait for the arrival of March of the Machines in a few months. But before we get started with that, I want to thank Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring this video series and helping me bring this content to you as we look at spoilers from different sets. And please remember to like and subscribe so you can get further content like this from future sets of Magic the Gathering. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the top 10 cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One. So before we get started with specific cards in the top 10, I want to point out as honorable mentions the 5 dual lands from the set. All of these enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer lands. So these are what we would call fast lands, where if you play them on turn 1, 2, or 3, you're going to be able to play it untapped. And these are going to replace in some of our decks the pain lands and just become really good cards for us. So mana will continue to be, for the most part, not really an issue. So 3-color decks, potentially even 4 and 5-color decks, are going to be very possible in Standard. Also, as honorable mentions, I want these 5 legendary creatures. Each of them has an important ability, and because of that, I think they're things that are relevant to Standard. So the first is Thrun, Breaker of Silence. Thrun is a good card, and I think going to be finding a home in the green deck because it can't be countered, it has trample, and it has protection from everything basically but green, and on your turn it's indestructible. That makes it a fine magic card that should see play in a variety of green decks. Next we have Varan, Executioner Thran for a colorless and a black mana. So this 2-drop is a Phyrexian vampire. It's a 2/2. And whenever one or more of other creatures you control die, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. It only triggers once a turn, but you can imagine that in the only called Anvil deck and other decks where you don't really care if you're losing creatures every turn, that 2 damage every turn will stack up pretty quickly and will help win black games throughout Phyrexia All Will Be One Standard season and beyond. Next we have Sulfim Mayhem Dominus for 4 mana. You get a Phyrexian Horror, that's a 5/4. And this is, to me, the burn card of the deck, or of the set, really. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. There's already kind of a burn deck in Standard right now. I think this is now the top end. Put it into the deck as something that's just going to help to finish off your opponent, because instead of having play with fire deal 2 damage to your opponent, it's now 4. Lightning Strike deals 6. And then we also have Light Up the Stage that has seen very little play over the course of its time in Standard, but now might be the time for Light Up the Night to see some serious Standard play, because even if you're casting it for 4 mana, it's doing 3 damage to your opponent, that becomes 6. Or if you're playing it really in the late game, it could be 7, 8, 9, potentially even 10 damage to an opponent. I think that's a fantastic thing. And I think burn will be a little bit more prevalent as we continue. And hopefully we'll get another burn card or 2 that make it into the deck. Next we have Mandrake Glory Dominus for 4 mana. This is our token doubling Dominus. If 1 or more tokens would be created under your control, twice that many tokens would be created. This goes in a variety of decks. We've got a lot of decks that create tokens just because, and the result of that is this fits into all of those decks very nicely to generate extra tokens, and it doesn't matter what kind of token it is, it just matters that it's a token. And finally we have Uktus Grand Metatech for 3 mana. It has 2 very relevant abilities, I think, for Standard. First is other blue creatures you control have, when this creature becomes tapped, draw a card, then discard a card. So that filtering ability is very powerful. So the mono blue temple deck, I think this is a nice spot for that, as a couple of in that deck. And then other artifact creatures you control get +1/+1. So there, we've got a tremendous amount of artifact creatures in Standard right now, probably more than we've had in several years because of those from the Brothers' War and those that we're getting in Phyrexia All Will Be One. So I think this is well positioned to support a artifact creature deck, and there are good artifact creatures in blue and in pretty much all the colors. So I can see a 3-color deck where Uktos is kind of a card that really brings things together and helps push damage against your opponent. All right, that's it for honorable mentions. Let's get into our top 10. At number 10, we have Nissa, Ascended Animist. For 7 mana, you get a legendary Planeswalker Nissa with 7 loyalty. If you pay the Phyrexian mana with life, you lose 2 loyalty counters each time you do that. So at the worst, Nissa costs 5 mana and you get 3 loyalty counters. Her +1 ability creates a XX green Phyrexian horror creature token where X is Nissa Ascended Animist loyalty. So at the worst, you're going to get a 4/4 that protects Nissa. And I think that's a really powerful ability to put out a 4/4 that's going to protect you right away. Her -1 ability allows you to destroy an artifact or an enchantment. Again, we've got lots of those running around Standard right now, so that ability will be very relevant on the card. And then for -7 until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. And I think really that's the thing that sells me the most on this card is your ability to ultimate Nissa, and then every creature you have has trample, and they're probably getting 4 or 5 additional power and toughness to hopefully finish off your opponent on that turn. And because of that, I can see you play Nissa as a 7-drop, and then your opponent just like concede at that point, because in all likelihood you're going to win on that turn with all the damage you're going to create from Nissa Ascended Animist. At number 9, we have Black Sun's Twilight. For X and a black mana, you get an instant that up to 1 target creature gets -X/-X till the end of the turn, and if X is 5 or more, return a creature card with mana value X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. I love this card. And the ability to kill your opponent's best creature probably, and then get back, say, your Sheoldred from the graveyard, is just an incredibly powerful ability. And I don't think that many decks are going to be able to deal with that. And the fact that it occurs at instant speed, you can cast it, on a relevant attack of your opponent, you can cast it on their end step, and then you untap with whatever that creature is on the battlefield. You will probably use it sometimes at a lower mana value, but I think it's just so relevant that we're going to see a good bit of it in Standard. Next, I have the Filigree Silex at number 8. It's a legendary artifact. You can tap it to put an oil counter on the Filigree Silex, and then you can tap it also and sacrifice the Filigree Silex, destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on the Filigree Silex. So it becomes like an ability that really kind of wipes out a line of creatures on the field. So, for example, against the Soldiers deck, you probably do it for 2 and you wipe out half their creatures. And that, I think, is a pretty important ability. Even if you're playing against a token deck and there's lots and lots of tokens on the field, you don't have to put an oil counter on the Filigree Silex. You can just tap it and wipe out all of their tokens. So very powerful ability. And where I think it's going to shine is in an oil counter deck, where you're going to use its ultimate ability, quote unquote, where you're going to tap it, remove 10 oil counters from among permanents you control, and then sacrifice the Filigree Silex and do 10 damage to any target, which means to your opponent most likely. In the ability to become a burn spell, I think makes this incredibly powerful and for a very, very low mana investment. So in that right deck, this is going to be an incredibly powerful finisher. And a lot of times decks don't have too much difficulty getting their opponent down to 10 life. So this just becomes a nice finisher in those decks. All right, at number 7 we have Skrelv Defector Might. For a white mana, you get a legendary artifact creature that's a Phyrexian Might. It's a 1/1. It has Toxic 1. It cannot block, but it has a very relevant ability, and that's for a Phyrexian white mana. You can tap Skrelv, and you get to choose a color, and another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and Hexproof from that color until the end of the turn. It cannot be blocked by creatures of that color this turn. So you can use it as something to defend a creature that you might lose to a removal spell, or you can use it as a means of getting an attack through an opponent when they have some blockers, but you want to get your creature through. You can make it unblockable by giving it color protection from the creature color that your opponents have on the battlefield. And that makes it a very good card for Standard. Now, let me move on to our number 6, and we'll get back to Skrelv with that. Number 6 is Skrelv's Hive. For 1 and a white mana, you get an enchantment, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life, and you create a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might creature token with Toxic 1. And this creature cannot block. It also has Corrupted. As long as an opponent has 3 or more poison counters, creatures you control with Toxic have lifelink. So this and Skrelv, I think, go together incredibly well, and I can see them actually in multiple decks together, because Skrelv is basically a God's Willing on a creature where you get to protect it, a creature card from a particular color. And then with Skrelv's Hive, now you have this ability to kind of have this continuous army of mites that will come out. So it fits into token decks, it fits into the Toxic deck, and it probably even fits into potentially a mono white deck if you've got some way of increasing the power, whether it's through a wedding announcement or whether in the trenches, something like that, to help increase the power level and toughness of all your creatures. So I think this is just an incredibly powerful card and is going to see a lot of Standard play in a lot of different decks. And maybe the one the card that we haven't seen a lot of play is Jetmir from the Streets of New Capenna, and I think this partners with that so well that in all likelihood we're going to see that combination of stuff in the near future. All right, at number 5, we have Sheoldred's Edict. For 1 and a black mana, you get to do one of the following. Each opponent is either going to sacrifice a non-token creature, they're going to sacrifice a token creature, or they're going to sacrifice a Planeswalker. And that last ability is the most relevant. We really don't have a tremendous amount of Planeswalker direct removal in Standard. This does that. And a lot of times your opponent, when they have Planeswalkers on the field, they tend to only have one. So whatever that is, you get to kill it at that point. And the relevance of being at instant speed cannot be understated, because your opponent plays the Wandering Emperor. The Wandering Emperor comes down and it kills a creature probably when you're attacking, but then you can, in response to it, kill the Wandering Emperor right away, so you don't have to deal with it on your opponent's turn. And I think that's an incredibly important ability. Or you see your opponent play a Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, it might create the token, but you kill Teferi right away, and that makes that a little bit less powerful. Or you use this to kill the token that it has created. So I think there's a lot of variability in this, and the importance of removal cannot be understated, and this definitely is the best removal card from Phyrexia. All will be one. At number 4, I've got Luca, Bound to Ruin. For 5 mana, 2, a red, a green, and a Phyrexian red or green mana, you get a legendary Planeswalker Luca with 5 loyalty. If you pay 2 life for the Phyrexian Phyrexian mana cost, then it has 2 fewer loyalty when it comes into play. But I can see decks being able to play Luca on turn 3 if you're paying for the Phyrexian mana. And the thing that I like about Luca the most is he is a mana dork in and of himself, because you plus him, he adds 2 mana to spend on creatures or activated abilities of creatures. And that is very powerful because you can play Luca on, say, turn 3 or 4 and then uptick him immediately. And the consequence or result of that is that Luca then leads you to be able to cast something else on that same turn that will help protect Luca. And then you can just grow and grow and grow your mana base to a point where you can cast 6, 7 mana spells or costing spells. And the result of that is you're going to have a pretty big board state. He also, for -1, creates a 3/3 Phyrexian Beast token with Toxic 1. And then for -4, Luca deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control as you activate this ability. So Luca's -4 is nothing to be scoffed at, because we're going to have in green things like Titan of Industry that go well with Luca, because with Luca's ability you can get Titan of Industry into play as early as turn 4 or 5, and then you go ahead on the next turn, you -4 Luca, you wipe out most of their board, and you're attacking into your opponent and doing a tremendous amount of damage. So I think that in and of itself, that combination of abilities make Luca a very playable planeswalker and makes Gruul now a very, very good potential deck in Standard. At number 3, we have Tyrannix Rex. For 7 mana, you get a Phyrexian dinosaur that's an 8/8. And very importantly, this spell cannot be countered. It has Trample, Ward 4, and Haste, and Toxic 4. By far the best creature in the set. And again, as I've been talking about with other cards, the ramp ability in green is good enough right now. You couple that with Luca, and it's not inconceivable that you could be casting this as early as turn 4 or 5. And when you do, your opponent's not going to be able to deal with it. And if this attacks twice, your opponent's pretty much dead at that point. So I think we're going to see this as the top end of a variety of decks. Anything that's got green in it is going to want to see this as a top end. Even those Reanimator decks that we're seeing would want this in it, because it's just an outstanding card. At number 2, we've got Phyrexian Arena. For 3 mana, you get an enchantment that at the beginning of your upkeep, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Black wants additional card draw. A loss of a life isn't that much to pay for that additional card. So I think this is a 2, 3, maybe even 4 of in mono black decks. Any black decks that are out there, like the Esper deck or Grixis deck, are going to want a couple of copies of this as that ability to just generate additional card draw. And black has so many other ways to gain life at this point, Sheoldred obviously being the biggest one, that the loss of 1 life isn't going to be all that important to you. And because of that, Phyrexian Arena is going to see a lot of play in Standard. And at number 1, we have Ichor Moon Gauntlet. For 2 and a blue mana, you get an artifact with 2 unique abilities on it. First is planeswalkers you control have 0 proliferate and -12, take an extra turn after this one. And then it also has the ability of whenever you cast a non-creature spell, choose a counter on target permanent, put an additional counter of that kind on that permanent. I think this is a bonkers card. The ability to proliferate as a loyalty ability of planeswalkers is going to be relevant, and being able to give every single one of that ability. If you're playing a Super Friends deck, you could easily, get all of your planeswalkers fairly close to that 12 just by proliferating each of the planeswalkers that you have. And if your opponent can't deal with them, it will not be long before you're taking extra turns. And at that point, the game's probably over. And that secondary ability, I think, is equally important, because we already have kind of a Super Friends deck out there. And we have 10 new planeswalkers. So we have around 30 total planeswalkers now in Standard. This card is going to see play because of that, because everybody's going to be trying to play planeswalkers, especially early in Phyrexia. All will be 1 season, and then as we move into March of the Machines and other sets in the fall, it's going to see more and more play because we're going to get more and more Planeswalkers that are relevant to it. So in my mind, best card from Standard for Standard, and probably other formats as well, that anywhere we're seeing a lot of Planeswalkers seeing play, this card's going to be included in them. All right, so that's it for my top 10 cards from Phyrexia All Will Be One. Thanks for staying around to the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe to the content, and special thanks again to Caffeinated Gamers for sponsoring our video. And we'll be back with more spoilers in a couple months from March of the Machines. Thanks. I'll see you next time.